Welcome to Resilience Unravelled. I'm your host, Dr. Russell Thackeray. This podcast is a result of my fascination with health issues, resilience, performance, mental health, accountability and critical thinking, along with many of the other obsessions I bump into in my life. I spend my time working with highly successful teams, organisations and people, and this podcast introduces their remarkable stories, as well as my synthesis of the key issues, tips and strategies to thrive in life. If you find this podcast useful, you can also find other information at qedod.com or russellthackeray.com. Stay tuned to the end for details of how to order a free ebook. Enjoy the podcast. Hi, so today I've got a very interesting interview. Something I've been looking forward to talking about for many years in actual fact. And it's been rare for me to have the opportunity to meet someone who is both very pragmatic about this subject, but also has worked in the corporate field. And today we're going to talk to Donna Landy, and it's fair to say that Donna is transgender. Now, for some people, they're not quite clear what this means. Some people get lost in the politics of this. Some people get lost in the sort of media storm about what this subject is. But I met Donna in a professional capacity in a work setting where she was presenting as female. And I've been remarkably impressed by her story, her courage. And I thought it was great to share that, both to talk about the resilience required to undertake this sort of personal journey, and but also for other people to understand their part in this journey and how they can make it more simple, both in terms of work, but also in their own lives if they're coming across people who are part of their own orbit. So, morning, first of all, Donna.
Good morning, Russell.
So tell me what part of the world you're in, Donna. Where are you?
I'm in the southwest of England, in a little fishing village, which is rather nice, where I live most of my time, and I work up in central England, so I do a bit of a long commute, and that's where we met, as you mentioned earlier.
We met in the wilds of the Cotswolds, I think. It was somewhere. I'd like to say it was somewhere gorgeous, but it wasn't, was it? It was just far more glamorous than it was. The wells of Cheltenham. Well, anyway, thank you so much, first of all, to join me on this podcast. I think a lot of people have heard about this subject and might benefit from actually hearing from someone who's going through this process. So, can you start by telling people what transgender means? What is it actually all about?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think it is, as you say, the kind of top of the mind question that comes up when people think about this, and they kind of wonder, what is it? What does it mean? And the most common misconception that I've come across, and I think this is fairly common, is that people think it's the same thing as being a transvestite or cross-dresser, and that it's some sort of fetish, only that you've decided to do it full time, which is very much far from the truth. For me, being trans is simply knowing inside that I am a woman, even though I was born in a man's body and I've lived most of my life as a man. And I'm one of those people they call what they call late onset. So there's a lot of stuff on the media about young people who realize very early on, or have known from a very long time, from a very early age, that they are a different gender to the one they were born with. So that's not the same in my case. My experience is that although there were clues earlier on, I very much suppressed it, even to myself, to the extent that I wasn't consciously aware of it at all. But it all just popped out very much in later life, when suddenly the penny dropped and I suddenly went, oh, that's what it is. And there wasn't really any turning back from that point. It was such a liberation, a moment of freedom and release, that it was obviously true. And quite soon afterwards, I took steps to come out. I started to come out to my nearest and dearest, to my family and close friends. And a few months after that, I came out at work and I started living full time as Donna, at least at work. And gradually took steps to transition in that way. So yeah, being transgender really is about knowing yourself in a certain way as a gender different to the one you were assigned at birth. It's not about You can be transgender and live completely as the gender you lived your whole life. That's really what it is.
And I think people, what's interesting, first of all, you said that some people regard it as a fetish thing or as a lifestyle choice, but this is no easy choice to make and to execute, is it?
It certainly isn't. It's excruciatingly embarrassing when you go out the first time dressed as the other gender. It's really difficult to get yourself to a state where you even look halfway like the other gender at a glance. And people do look, even well-meaning people sort of look just despite themselves, really. But the worst is with close family. I have young children and a now ex-wife, and it's been incredibly hard on them. The impact on sort of having me disappear, if you like, the father and the husband that they knew has gone, dead without a funeral. So it's a kind of grief with no name, which is really, really sad and strange and hard for them to come to terms with. On the plus side, of course, they have still got me, a kind of strange ex-wife, if you like, and an auntie, or not a new mum really, but someone who's always there for them still and loves them totally and unconditionally. So it's not all minuses, but there's certainly a lot to come to terms with.
Yeah, and I know the stats would say that trans people experience the most hate crime. They have such a high incidence of suicide and anxiety and such like. And is that because of the process itself or society's method of dealing with or trying to accept what this thing is all about?
I'm not really sure why that would be. But from my own side, I'd say it is difficult coming out, just because you have to get through a lot of layers of social acceptance, if you like. I mean, some people are brilliant and say, "Oh, congratulations," and accept you completely, and other people are a bit like, "Oh," and others you do get some hostile looks in the street. I've not really had. I've only had one kind of hostile interaction with somebody where they were just really funny with me, and I had a couple of kids yell at me in the street, but I confronted them, and the look of guilt and shame on their face was quite enough. I didn't need to do anything more. Bless them. And I just think that's something that came out of their, young boys. They yell stuff, and that's how they are. So I don't really take it as anything particularly anti-trans, if you like.
Yes.
So I think in general, people have been pretty good. But if you've got family, dealing with the fact that, like, for me, what's been really hard is dealing with the fact that, in a way, I'm the one who killed my kid's dad.
Yes.
And it's not as if I had a choice, really. And people think you have a choice about when you transition, if you transition, if you have about the speed of transition. But in a way, you don't really. It kind of does its own thing. And knowing that I was going to do that was one of the most dreadful things in my life, really. Because it broke my children's hearts.
Yes.
And that's just the worst, most awful thing you can think of. The other thing that's really difficult is waiting for treatment.
Right.
You can dress in clothes that suit your style and your gender, and that's great. But quite soon you get to the point where you want, I want to actually take concrete steps to change my body and to be the opposite gender, and that involves hormone therapy and all sorts of things. And at the moment, when I joined the NHS waiting list, I was referred pretty quickly by my doctor, who is really supportive, which I understand is not universal in the UK. Some are quite obstructive. So mine was really good, and I got referred straight away to the clinic, and I was told the waiting list was about a year. Well, as far as I'm aware, that was a year and a half ago, and I'm still about a year from receiving any treatment on the NHS, except that now they won't give me any kind of concrete deadline when I would be seen. So I'm in an indefinite queue waiting for treatment. And in that time, there's no support whatsoever they can give you. There's no counselling, there's no therapy, there's no groups, There's absolutely nothing available to support me or my family. Everything we found, we've had to find out ourselves on the internet, through local groups, volunteer organisations, and so on. And I'm lucky enough that I'm in the position that I could go to get private treatment in London and get a private diagnosis, and then get medications through a UK GP who does this kind of service. If it wasn't for that, I'd still be stuck in a queue. And I think the people who are stuck in a queue of an indefinite period, with no guaranteed, not even a guaranteed time to be seen, can be a very depressing situation. The second thing I think is, I'm now of an age where I have resources and so forth to fight my own battles, but young people particularly would have to be, even to go and get seen on the NHS, they have to have the support of their parents. And even then, they won't get hormone therapy until they're 16 or 17, as far as I understand. So I can quite imagine that the rate of depression in young trans people is massive, because they have to go through puberty as the sex they don't, or gender they don't want to be. And plus they have to deal with bullying, which seems to be endemic around where I live in any case, in schools, about this sort of subject, where people will tease about almost any sort of difference, however hard schools try and take it in hand. I don't see that there's really much gets done about that.
Well, should we go back to the beginning? Because you mentioned,
yes,
actually there were some clues, and I'm interested to sort of discuss that in a bit, because often one sort of trajectory for people is either to recognise they're trans at the beginning and live their entire lives that way. Some people seem to take an alternative route, which is almost to either run away from, hide from it, not recognise it, and they end up living quite macho lives often. And the reverse is also true for people who transition from female to male, as well as male to female. And you mentioned the cues, and I know there's a lot in the debate at the moment about this, whether children understand the concept of gender, and whether pre-puberty it's actually a good time to stop puberty happening. So I'm just interested in, when you had your first clues, given that this actually became the case, that given that this came to define your life in a sense.
Yes, I do understand there's some sort of statistics bandied around about how many young people don't eventually go through with it. But I've also read counter arguments that say that a lot of the statistics aren't being used in the right way, and people, for example, who couldn't be followed up are counted as not having followed through with their gender transition, when actually it's not known about. So I think there is definitely room for debate both ways on that one. But I do think if a young person is absolutely sure over a long period of time that they are the opposite gender to how their body expresses, then I think we should listen to them. I do. I think it's cruel to do otherwise. And I mean, I don't think anyone knows for certain. You can't really, but for me, that does seem incredibly cruel and insensitive.
So, what the clues that you mentioned earlier that you had?
The clues that I had were a strong sense of wishing. I remember wishing really strongly when I was 10, like I wish I was a girl. I really do. I wanted to play all their games in the playground. I wanted to join in the skipping at primary school. Then they were like, well, you can't. Why not? You're a boy. And I don't remember being particularly, my impression of myself is that I'm not particularly macho, but my dad thinks, one of the things my dad said when I came out was, he was surprised because I'd led such a, sort of macho life. I was like, what? What were some of the other early clues? I grew up in an Orthodox Jewish background, which incidentally I think might have been one of the reasons why I suppressed it so strongly, because it's really not, it's just not something that would even come up. I don't think you wouldn't discuss it. But on the Jewish festival of Purim, it's dressing up is encouraged, and one of the characters you can dress up as, or you can dress up as anything, but one of the frequent characters to dress up as is this Persian king called Achashverosh. And I dressed up in one of my mum's dresses, a nice purple dress. And for me, it was like, oh, wow, I finally get to wear a woman's dress and I look great in it. So, yeah, I remember asking a girlfriend that I quite liked and saying, "Don't look great in this," and being very disappointed that she didn't think so. So there were clues like that. What else can I say?
Was it a nagging sensation which you almost had to work hard to ignore or squash or something? Was it there all the time? Did it appear and reappear? How did it manifest itself? I'm just thinking of someone who's dealing with someone, or listening to a child or even a family member talking about it. What are the things to look out for, really? I mean, certainly saying something, but when did you start pushing it away?
I think it was just incredibly private from forever, because of teasing at school about, gay, or as it was then very unkindly called, kids would call each other homo in the playground as a term of abuse. So anything that wasn't, male, masculine, whatever, would get teased, picked on, etc. So, if you've gone around at school saying, "Oh, you know what, I think I want to be a girl," or I am a girl, or I want to be a girl, that just would have been endless. Yeah. So that's just something that I kept incredibly private.
So if your kids do come and say something to you, you really should take it seriously.
Absolutely. I mean, I've had one youngster friend of one of my daughters say that she thought she was trans, and I was like, "Oh, that's interesting. What makes you think that?" And she would explain to me, and I'm like, okay. I mean, I wasn't trying to. Obviously, I try really hard not to, convince her one way or the other, but just to get appropriate support and to find people to talk to and let it work itself out. Either she would find out she was or she wasn't, but it's quite a difficult time. I think growing up is hard anyway for a lot of children, and having that as an added pressure just makes it harder.
Yeah, and so post puberty, you lived your life in the sort of male shape and form. How did that work out? I mean, a lot of people confuse transness and sexuality, sexual orientation, but people need to understand that those two things are separate, don't they?
Oh yes, very much so. In my own case, I'm attracted to women, and that's been the same throughout my whole life, and that's not changing as I transition. But I think one of the things to watch out for, and I think this kind of goes to the taboo about mental health, is that even to our own children, we don't like to show that we might have any issues with low mood or depression or anxiety or anything. We just put on a good front, and it encourages our children to do the same. So I'm sure there are families where it's different, but there does seem to be a bit of a taboo about this subject, and it's only thanks to recent campaigns by Prince Harry and the Lloyd's advert and things like that, which are really bringing it into the forefront of how important it is to talk about these things and allow everyone a chance to vent their feelings. And having these unexpressed feelings and inside can lead to mental health issues for young people. And if they get the chance to talk to the grown-ups in their life about it, and they are understanding and supportive, and allow them to enter the inquiry openly, then I think it would mitigate all of the sort of self-harm issues that can come up, like this shown in that recent ITV drama, and also the potential for suicide, and give children the support that they need and deserve. So yeah, from my side in later life, I had a lot of trouble with low mood. I used to drink quite a lot to try and escape some sort of feelings of I don't know what. It was always a bit nebulous. People used to think I was gay, but I knew I wasn't, and it was all a bit of a sort of mystery. And I could sense that other people weren't the same, but I couldn't figure out why or what was different about me.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, the penny has really dropped. One of my oldest and best friends, when I told her she said, "Oh," she said, "remember how we always used to think that maybe you were gay?" And that makes complete sense.
Mm.
So, yeah. But,
Interesting, isn't it? So it's always there, and people pick it up, but they pick up using the terminology of the time, because obviously 20 years ago this was less common or less in the public eye. So the sort of sexual orientation thing was probably an easier way to start addressing the issue. And by all stretch of imagination, you lived a successful life as a male, didn't you? I mean, you've held down, you've got an impressive employment track record, and you've got families and such like. So what's the itch like? What's this drive? I mean, how do you choose to give up this, what seems a comfortable life? What, how can you help us understand this sort of an innermost drive to be who you really are, but what seems to be at odds with everything that's gone before?
It is strange, isn't it? Because, I mean, like you say, there are so many drivers to keep status quo and everything that seems to be working. But the inner knowledge suddenly that is who I am is such a powerful thing. And it's such, I just feel so content suddenly, like in a way that I never did before. I'm completely content with who I am and at peace with who I am, regardless of the fact that, chaos is unfolding in my life, effectively. Marriage breaking down and moving house and changing jobs and all sorts of things that are going on at the same time. But inside myself, I was the happiest I'd ever been.
Right.
So that's the driver.
And I'm guessing also we talk in resilience terms about having a strong sense of purpose, knowing that, again, once you've recognized this and maybe admitted it to yourself, I guess you can start to have the resources to tackle a journey ahead, because you actually found yourself in a way, and therefore your sense of purpose reconnects with who you are.
Exactly so. And it's only when you hit like brick walls, like the NHS, that things don't go according to plan. But otherwise, like you say, there's this inner drive to work things out and to find a way.
And so talking about a work context, because for a moment, how does that work? If who do you talk to? I mean, how does that conversation begin to happen at work? Because my understanding is a lot of people will do what they call part trans, so they'll be trans in their private life, but at work they cannot transition. And you must have had a good employer, but also you must have an enormous amount of courage to sort of tackle that thing. So what was your process? How did you make that work?
Well, I did have a very good employer who was really understanding and supportive. I suspect, like most employers, they didn't have any previous cases of people like myself, so they didn't have a roadmap of how to do it. So we were both kind of making it up as we went along, and there were a few bumps along the way, but we managed to iron them out. The process for me started with, I think, going to my line manager and talking to him, and also talking to HR, and finding them surprisingly but really understanding, and asking me like, well, which toilets would you like to use? And that saying they would be driven by that rather than telling me what I could do. Because I didn't understand at that point that I have rights about that sort of thing in the Equalities Act. So I'm glad to see that they were actually following those. My manager was very understanding, and I told a few close colleagues with varying responses. I tend to find the younger they are, the better, because they've had more exposure to it than the older generations. But nobody was outright hostile at all. So some people were just more surprised, and others were more excited for me. Right. So
just to leap in for a moment, if you're a line manager or an HR person, and someone comes to talk to you, what's the single best thing you can do to help that person?
First thing is you can congratulate them. You can wish them congratulations, because they're going to be delighted internally that they have found their inner peace and freedom, and they will probably be terrified that you're going to be anti, or that you're going to say, well, you can't do that here, and that they'll have a big push uphill to come out. So it's already probably taken them a good deal of courage to face you and to say what they've said.
Yeah.
So if you can congratulate them and acknowledge them for their courage in coming out, and say that you're on their side and you'll support them through it, whatever that's going to look like, and that you'll work with them to make a roadmap for that transition if that's what they plan to do, then that would be incredibly supportive. It really would.
Yeah.
I think other things in general, I mean, most companies don't have any sort of information or training about what trans is and what it isn't. That would be helpful if they could find a useful resource so that people who are interested could at least, they might meet someone who's trans at the workplace and go, oh, what the heck is that about? And then look on the intranet or something and try and find some resources.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what about colleagues? How do you want your colleagues to be around you? And I know that's a weird question, but I've never thought about it that way around. How is, if you were a colleague of mine, how would I best support you again?
Oh, it's really hard to say. I suppose it's quite unique. There's just treat me how you would anybody else. I would say that's the best. Yeah. I think some of the best conversations I've had with people haven't even talked about it at all. It's just, well, how's life? And what's up and what you're into, and just the sort of things you would talk to anyone else about. But I'm equally happy to talk about it in the right context over a coffee, and especially with people that have known me before I transitioned, because I do appreciate it takes something to go from one to the other, and also to relax about it. I mean, I know obviously I like to be called by my feminine name and referred to as she and her, but people who've known me previously do slip, and I even slip sometimes. So, it's one of those things. You don't out-train your habits in a flash. Yeah. So just have to all be a bit tolerant and easygoing, I think.
And that's one of the things I think a lot of people find a bit daunting, because there's a sort of I was going to say the word militant wing, and I don't mean that, but there are people who are there are less tolerant in the trans world who take greater offence at misgendering, even by accident. And I think people have to realise it takes time, isn't it, to accept each other.
It does, and I think a lot of the time it's not about acceptance, it's simply habit of the mind that you... I mean, imagine if somebody you've been calling Ben all these years suddenly says, look, I want you to call me John. You're in the heat of the moment, when you're thinking about the project and everything else and all the other people, you might accidentally refer to them as Ben, not out of any malice, just out of the fact that you're distracted. And really nothing is meant. So I think that if somebody misgendered me or called me by my old name deliberately in order to offend me, that would be outrageous. But that's no one. I mean, I can't imagine anyone at my current work doing that intentionally. It's just that they're just not that kind of people. So I think if somebody makes an honest mistake, why would you come down on them like a ton of bricks? It's just one of those things, isn't it? It's not always easy to take. It's not that it doesn't necessarily cause a reaction for me, but I think that's something I have to process internally and not take out on them, or maybe have a quiet word later if it's appropriate. But just as a friendly thing over a coffee. But often they wouldn't even have noticed. They would just have, it just comes out.
Excellent. So, and I mean, you've talked about the challenges. You've talked about the impact of your family and your children, and this treatment curve, and the fear and the anxiety and the pressure and the calmness and peace and happiness. But I mean, where are you getting all this energy from? Where are you getting this tremendous resilience from? Where's the wellspring?
That's a good question. I think it's something like the knowledge that I am just being who I am, and not having that burden of having to, it's not like pretend to be someone else, but there was a kind of gratingness that became apparent when I started to transition that I hadn't noticed before. And I think that's probably what people call the dysphoria, the feeling of uncomfortableness, that you're not who you really are. And then when you can drop that, then suddenly there's like this whole realm of happiness and well-being from a deep inner place that just gives you, it's just, I expect most people just have that. A lot of people have that anyway, naturally, from their lives, and wouldn't know what it would be like to be missing that.
Yeah.
So
That's an interest. I mean, people do bang on about this idea of authenticity, but actually, that's what you're actually describing, isn't it? A proper theory of authenticity. Because a lot of people spend a lot of time lying to themselves or hiding their true self away. But in a sense, what you're talking about is the true benefit of being the real you.
yes, and I suppose it's not it doesn't solve all your problems in life, because it's only
Like
one realm of authenticity. But yeah, exactly. But it's so fundamental that without it, you can't really. I don't think you can get very far.
Yes. And so, how long does this journey take you, Don? I mean, how much further do you have to go?
I'm still got a long way ahead of me. Like I say, I'm still waiting for treatment on the NHS, so be quite a long time until surgery. A number of years now until surgery. I'd also like to get some voice training, because I still sound very masculine on the phone and on podcasts, I'm sure. Which is quite confusing for people on the phone when I'm calling up for the first time. I have to explain that I'm trans, and they can finally understand how to spell the name Donna, which is interesting.
FRED.
They think I'm Don or Donald or something else.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's quite a long way to go in the journey, but I've made a good start, and so I'm quite happy where I am on the track.
And would you encourage people like yourselves and people who are not trans to reach out, help each other, just support each other, treat you as anybody else in a way?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think like you're implying, it's kind of part of a wider spectrum of things which are not necessarily on most people's radar. Mental health. We've had a mental health week at work, mental health awareness week, where people are encouraged to speak out. If it's 1 in 4 people who have had mental health issues, there's an awful lot of people who are sitting there and suffering in silence that nobody knows about. And why wouldn't you want to support your colleagues if they're having a hard time? If they were ill in some physical way in their body, you would of course support them. And if they're ill in some way in their mind, why not? And why does it have to be so embarrassing? And same about gender issues, same about sexuality. We should, if we're not supporting the diversity in our workplace, then we're all losing out. And that is the truth for all of us, whether you're part of more mainstream groups in your life or whether you're part of minorities. It's the same.
And there's a massive degree of discrimination against trans people to get them back into the workplace, which is why I was so pleased to meet you, because you were sort of a beacon of hope, really, for a lot of trans people who don't think they can get work, either because they've changed their name and they've lost their employment record, the whole of their actual physical identity changes and vanishes. But also there seems to be a massive degree of discrimination out there, and often people with superb talent, but just being discriminated against because they've changed gender. And it just seems inherently unfair, doesn't it? And if you want a diverse population, you surely yours is a community to welcome with open arms.
I would say so. It was one of the fears that I had when I was transitioning was, well, what will I do? I'm a contractor and an IT contractor, so I go from role to role. And what about my previous record? And what if they discriminate against me because of that I'm trans, and they just don't feel comfortable with it for whatever reason? And they wouldn't necessarily have to give a reason. They could just say, oh well, we had a better qualified candidate. So I took a permanent role for a while that came up, and that worked well for a bit. But what I made sure about on my CV, I put my new name, but I also put my former name on, so that if they called for a reference from previous employer, they would know who to ask for.
Yeah.
Otherwise, like you say, you kind of lose your previous employment record, and I think then things would be difficult, because certainly in the contracting world, you're only as good as your last reference, and they don't tend to call back more than 1 or 2 references, if that.
Yeah.
So that is very important. But I think my experience so far has been that people actually, certainly in my world, they don't care about me transitioning. They absolutely couldn't care. If I can write the software that they want, if I can deliver the result they want, they'll employ me. If I can't, they won't. It's as simple as that. And that's quite a relief. I expect there may be some people out there who might discriminate, but from what I've found so far, people aren't discriminating, and that's quite a relief.
Yeah. And if you had one piece of advice for any aspirant trans person out there, or someone is wrestling with this problem, what would that one piece of advice be?
Get support. Find someone to talk to. Call a helpline. There's a great one in the Southwest called Intercom, which has a 24-hour helpline. They are wonderful to talk to. I'm sure there are others around the country. There is lgbt.info, I believe it is, or switchboard, which is also, don't think it's 24 hours, but again, it's a call center where you can call in and speak to someone who'll be understanding. So don't suffer in silence. Don't stay on your own. Find a local group, find local people, get on the phone and talk to somebody who will understand where you're at and can also point you in the right direction if that's what you want, or just be a listening ear if that's what you need.
Donna, I can personally say that you're an absolute inspiration, and it's been a joy to talk to you today. I think the more all of us can do to help awareness of trans issues, both for the community themselves and for people around it, is key. And I think you're setting a fantastic example. Thank you so much for spending time with us today. I'll put some links on our own website, qedod.com, and we'll put a page up perhaps /trans. And we'll put some links on our own site to some of those places you suggested. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Russell.
You take care.
Thank you. You too.
We hope you found today's podcast useful. If you did, why not subscribe and listen to our other podcasts? We would love it if you could leave us a review. To access our resilience coaching, contact us at info@qedod.com. And finally, if you'd like to download our free resilience ebook, go to qedod.com/free ebook. Thanks for listening.